Welcome to the Lutheran Podcast, where we promise not to nail 95 theses to your door. How you doing, Isaac?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing fantastic. It's been a couple weeks since we recorded. Good to be back,
Good to be back.
Great to be back.
Wonderful to be back.
Lutherans on the table.
Heck yeah.
We're going to start off kind of with history, go into beliefs, similar to what we did with the Baptist episode. Hopefully this isn't as long as the Baptist episode. But Lutherans, man, it's pretty wide range.
Yeah, it's cool.
Across the board. So starting off with history, obviously everyone knows Luther's name, tied to the Reformation. 1517 in Wittenberg, Germany. He nails 95 theses to the door. You wanna take it away with a bit of history of Luther?
Yeah. So, when you're talking about how there's a wide range of Lutherans, but they all kind of come back to Martin Luther. He was born in Germany in 1483, became a monk and a professor of theology at the University of Wittenberg. Luther's kind of study of the Bible was interesting because it was around the Catholic Church, but as he was reading the Bible, he was like, maybe there's just a little bit more here. And so he got to the point where in 1517 nailed the 95 theses to the door. I think that's something that, a little bit of a side note, we should pay a little more attention to that. Like, that was a big moment in the shift of the church and caused a lot of friction, which ended up creating another denomination. But it kind of just continued from there as he created the Lutheran Church and kind of just became more and more separate with a lot of their different theologies. It went to him translating the Bible into German, which up until then, what was it, Latin? Would have been Latin.
Yeah,
I think that was the case, and so a lot of people just couldn't read it, and so that was the idea behind the Catholic Church was we read it, we interpreted it to you. That was all that was necessary, and Luther was like, no, how about we read it? Here's a translation where you actually can read it. And that led into 1525, where we actually formed the Lutheran Church, and it emerged as like an actual branch of Christianity with its own unique liturgy and theological principles. And that kind of just led down the whole scope of new thought on Christianity, because up until then it was just Catholic theology. He started writing and making a lot more unique things other than the Bible after he translated it, including one that he was called the Augsburg Confession, and that's kind of the OG confession that a lot of Lutherans hold to. And so then after that, kind of kept splitting up a little bit more, and Luther, he ended up dying. That's not funny. And then it kept going from there, and we still have Lutheran churches to this day. And then we'll get into their theology and stuff, but
yeah, from what I saw, his main problem was indulgences in the Catholic Church. Which is where you could give money to the Catholic Church, and a priest would give you things to do, and it would kind of lessen your punishment in the afterlife.
And when he spoke out about that, he got excommunicated.
Imagine like heretic. That. Fun stuff. A bit more, so like I said, 1525, you kind of have the establishment of the State Church of Germany. Kind of spreads over to Sweden and Denmark, and Norway, kind of up in the Scandinavian area by the mid 1530s. You have the Church of Sweden, Denmark, and Norway established. There's a little fun moment. I don't have a date for this. Somewhere in the 1500s. A lot of times we think like new churches just kind of popped up, but in reality, it was a bunch of just Catholic churches
that
going away from the Catholic Church and switching. And so you had, to German states, right? You remember Prussia during this time is an absolute mess of just a bunch of little tiny different states. And so there's a unification between Saxon and Hesse, and they form this little Chaldic League, which was literally just a military offense against the Holy Roman Empire, which is, I thought, a little interesting fact. But jump forward after Napoleon's defeat in 1817. There's a unification of the Prussian Union of Churches, is what they call themselves. And this wasn't just Lutherans. Actually, there were Reformed churches a part of this. And it became one big church. And a lot of people really didn't like the fact that the Reformed were coming in and, quote unquote, watering down their beliefs. And so you had a mass exodus to America. And that's where a bunch of Germans came over to America with Lutheranism as their background. And in 1847, you have the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod was established, which is currently the second largest denomination. Denomination. Yeah, group of Lutherans in America. In 1960 and 1962, you had two different Lutheran churches established in America. You had the American Lutheran Church in 1960. In 1962, you had the Lutheran Church in America. Don't worry about it too much because they're going to merge very shortly. The Missouri Synod was very theologically conservative. And they had a seminary president at the time who was a bit more theologically liberal. And the president of the denomination did not like the president of the seminary, and so he tried to get him fired, which actually just led to the seminary just end up being independent, or as some people call a Seminex, which then this president went on to create the Association of Evangelical Lutheran Churches, the AELC. The AELC and the other two that I said, the American Lutheran Church and the Lutheran Church in America, all merged in 1987 to form what is now the ELCA, the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, which is the largest Lutheran church in America. Funny enough, worldwide, they're not even number two. The second largest is actually in Ethiopia, of all places, and that was the Swedish church sending missionaries in the 1900s down to Ethiopia after World War II. Back in Germany, so that's the American Church. We'll get to the ELCA and the Missouri Synod a bit later. The German Church went through some fun stuff during World War II.
Yes, they did.
So 1934 to 1945 is where we're looking. The majority of German churches, which were majority Lutheran at this time, did support the Nazis. And there was this movement called simply the German Christians, is literally what it was called. And Luther was anti-Semitic. He's not a fan of the Jews.
Was he anti-Semitic?
He was.
Oh, okay.
There were a few of his papers that were literally calling out the Jews. And so it was really easy for this German Christian movement to latch onto the Nazi movement. But there was a group that left or opposed the German Christians, led by a great man, Dietrich Bonhoeffer.
Yeah.
I had to bring him up.
OG.
He opposed Hitler, opposed the German Christians, and he and some other churches broke away from this Prussian Union of Churches and formed what they called the Confessing Church. Bonhoeffer was then later captured and executed near the end of the war.
Great bibliography, by the way.
Oh, phenomenal.
Absolutely
If
incredible.
you've never read anything from Bonhoeffer, go for it.
Yes.
After the war, the Prussian church reunited and really purged itself of all Nazi supporters, as one does when you lose the war. And in 1948, the other state churches that were not a part of the Prussian church formed what is known as the Evangelical Church in Germany, or the EKD. And in 2004, the Prussian church, which was now named the Evangelical Church of the Union, joined the EKD, and that is now the largest Lutheran body in the world. So it's still in Germany, and then, like I said, the second is the Mekane Jesus Church in Ethiopia, which was founded in 1957 by Swedish missionaries. So there's your long-winded history of the German church and the American church. I don't know if the ELCA is the third largest. I'm not sure. But that's all the history I have. I found it super interesting. I hope you did. But yeah, I don't know if you have anything else with history on your notes.
No, I like these churches that have such a rich historical background, and you can kind of see like an ebb and flow with it. Especially Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Like that man was incredible.
Yeah. Well, let's move into the beliefs. What makes a Lutheran a Lutheran compared to the rest? I found four fancy words that kind of make a Lutheran a Lutheran. They are confessional, which just says that they hold the creeds. The ecumenical creeds, the apostle creeds, the Nicene creeds, the Lutheran confessions, all those. Liturgical, evangelical, which for Lutherans, evangelical simply just means Protestant.
Yep.
They're just centered on the good news of Jesus, which they're just Protestant.
Yep. Nothing more than that.
But it is a distinction because they say it all the time. And then sacramental, they hold to the Lord's Supper, baptism, and then sometimes absolution or confession, depending on the Lutheran Church, but that's not across the board, is what I found. What you got over there?
Yeah. With basic theology that they would hold to, they hold to the kind of the main solas, the idea that the Bible has the authority as the sole source of doctrine and belief, which we call sola scriptura. Salvation is achieved through faith in Jesus Christ alone and not through good works. Very good distinction. So you're saved by faith alone. And then salvation is a result of God's grace. Humans cannot earn salvation through their actions. That idea of grace alone. Mm-hmm. And then Christ is the only mediator between God and humanity. Salvation is only through him. The idea of Christ alone. So faith alone, grace alone, Christ alone. And then the ultimate purpose of life is to glorify God. The idea of giving God the glory. Pretty basic theology, but wide-ranging, and that's very good.
Yeah. Kind of the one thing that I really found that separated the Lutheran Church from the rest, centered on baptism and centered on their view of salvation. They are infant Baptists. Typically, it's a sprinkling, not a pouring or immersion, but they believe baptism saves.
Yes.
And I'm going to make that general statement. I'm sure there's Lutheran churches out there that would disagree with that. But for the most part, they believe that baptism is, in fact, part of salvation. And they would say that the salvation experience is not a precise one moment in time thing. Instead, salvation starts at baptism and is then nurtured through one's life. That was what really I found separated them from the Reformed Church and from the Anglicans, which are kind of your three main movements that came out of the Reformation. And that seemed to be pretty unique to just Lutherans.
Do you know, are all Lutheran churches transubstantiation?
Transubstantiation?
Yeah, the idea of communion becoming the actual body and blood of Christ. I think they are. I don't know if all are, but I know Missouri.
I don't think all are. I know Missouri, their official statement is that you have to use wine and unleavened bread. Whereas the ELCA and the LCMC don't have that position. You can use grape juice and just crackers, wafers, bread, whatever.
Yeah.
I do know that Presbyterians would say that Christ is spiritually present in the bread. And I do know for Lutherans there is a significance where Christ is present in the bread, but I don't know if it's full transubstantiation where it becomes the body and blood of Christ, but Christ is present in the bread.
Okay.
I think there's a difference there.
Yeah, that's a interesting difference.
I'm not sure exactly what the difference is, but there is definitely a difference there. But by far, if you make a spectrum of like completely symbolic that the Baptists hold to spiritually present for the Presbyterians, Lutherans are then the next step of Christ is physically present in the elements.
And then Catholics would be
full transubstantiation, where Christ is also present in the elements, but the elements become his body and his blood, which maybe Lutherans hold that view. I'm sure some do, especially like if you get in like the Wisconsin, you're super uber theologically conservative. I bet you they might hold that view, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, because when I was looking it up, I kind of saw like some back and forth. Some did, some didn't, but then really no conclusion on whether Luther was for it or against it.
Yeah,
it didn't seem like it was one of his big problems with the church.
No.
And so I don't think he necessarily took a stance on that.
Yeah, I did not. I want to take a moment, but before we go more, and just talk about theologically conservative versus theologically liberal, because I don't think we've mentioned that a whole lot in Baptist. We kind of in the Baptist episode just like said it, but basically, a theologically conservative person would hold that the Bible is inerrant, and that the people, events, the miracles in the Bible are true, real people, literal miracles. That's kind of the conservative side, whereas the liberal side, some of those stories may be more mythical, and maybe it tends to be what science proves. The Bible will conform to what science proves.
Yep.
And they can kind of explain things in the Bible. It's like, oh, well, science says that the universe is billions of years old, so it can't be a literal 6-day creation. That's kind of a more theological liberal view, whereas a conservative would say it's still a 6-day creation because the Bible said so.
Yep.
And technically, they're not wrong. I have trouble saying that because I am a conservative, theologically conservative, so I would hold to the Bible as inerrancy. I think that is the correct view, but there is the theological liberal, and so it's hard to like pin down when we start to get specific views. Like, where do Lutherans stand on gay marriage?
Yep.
Well, they're both, because there's theologically conservative and theologically liberal Lutherans. So I just want to explain that before we keep going, just to throw it out there that there are people on both sides.
Yep.
For sure.
And the sad part about that is it's kind of split up denominations even more. So, we have these different denominations, but then you have different sects of the same denomination that just are a little more conservative or a little more liberal, a little more progressive in their interpretation of Scripture. It's interesting to watch and see, and I think that's a really good topic to talk about, because a lot of people, nowadays you can't, if you go up to someone and you're like, oh, I'm a Christian, it's like, well, what does that mean? Like, just saying you're a Christian doesn't really give a whole lot of information nowadays.
Yeah. I find that for theological conservatives, the denomination lines still matter.
Yes.
A lot to them. They'll go to war for them. Whereas the theologically liberal are much more like, we're both Christian.
Yep.
Why
that's
are we
all
like,
we need.
Why are we mad? And so you do see like, the PCUSA, the ELCA, the Baptist Fellowship, kind of all the theologically liberal sides of those denominations, are kind of just like, hey, why are we fighting? Let's just like be homies.
Yep.
Whereas the theologically conservative side, your SBC is technically theologically conservative, although there's a huge rift right now. Technically, the United Methodists are theologically conservative.
That's crazy.
They are currently splitting and fighting,
which is always sad.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the idea of unity with the progressive side is a good thing. The problem is I'm also theologically conservative, but the problem is it ends up becoming conformatory or just accepting of so many things, where the unity is great, but then on the other side, where we can be so dogmatic about, lines and certain things where we will compromise unity over what we believe is correct, which leads to more splits, more different sects of churches, and it's always sad to see.
Yeah,
we don't want to see that.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. But you definitely see, Missouri. I mean, we're talking about the sacraments, anyways. Like the Missouri Synod, or Synod. I don't know however you want to say it. They typically have a closed communion.
Yes, they do.
That is only for people within the Missouri Synod or other churches that the Missouri Synod is in communion with, which they are not in communion with all churches. I don't have those written down. Like they're not in communion with the ELCA. It's like if you're a part of the ELCA and you go to a Missouri Synod church, you're not supposed to take communion with them.
Yep.
Whereas the ELCA has open communion.
Yep.
To the point where if you're just a Christian, partake and eat with us.
Yep. They have no requirements.
Yeah, and so it even within the Lutheran Church is a huge, and like the two sacraments like really big to the Lutherans, and so there's even a split within them. However, they all baptize infants, and they all believe that baptism is a form of salvation. But yeah. Yeah.
Being so conservative that if you are not Missouri Synod Lutheran, you cannot take communion.
Yeah. And
I've been to a couple of those churches, and they won't say it. Like, they won't stop you. They won't be like, "Oh, we know you are not Missouri Synod Lutheran."
There's not a police in the back that's just like, "Oh."
Yeah, but they'll say it. They'll be like, if you are a member of Missouri Synod Lutheran, you are welcome to participate in communion. Not saying you can't, but suggesting.
They all do confirmation, which is typical for any church that does infant baptism. The LCMC, the Lutheran Congregation in Mission for Christ, they're kind of mixed when it comes to open communion. They're also definitely just like the middle line. Yeah. They split in 2001 and left the ELCA, but they're not quite as conservative as the Missouri. And there's also still the Wisconsin, the Wells Church that is even more conservative than the Missouri Synod. Even if I'm saying Synod and Synod over and over again. I'm even switching between the two.
I think it's Synod.
Whatever. You know what's interesting? That's the what's the word for how a church is structured?
Liturgy?
No. Like church governance. Polity. I
wouldn't have gotten there. I'm sorry.
No. So the Missouri, the LCMC, they are congregational, which is similar like the Baptist view that the church is the main authority. Yes. There's nothing above it. The congregation has all the power. The ELCA is it's not quite Episcopal, but it's a modified Episcopal view, which I thought was just fascinating that the ELCA of all of them would have a more Episcopal view, which pretty much say like there's a church-wide assembly that I don't know if it actually holds power or not, or any authority, but there is a region and there's a bishop. Those are kind of on the same level. But the bishop is like the in-between from the church-wide assembly and then whatever the synod is, or synod. And then each church within the synod also has a bishop, which they may just call a pastor or an elder. But that's kind of your down from the top down. But then a region will have multiple synods underneath it. And so it's a modified Episcopal structure, if that tickles your fancy of the structure of the church. But I don't know, I found it interesting that the ELCA was modified Episcopal, whereas the LCMC and the Missouri Synod is congregational. That was just interesting to me.
I love how we have the increase of putting modified in front of anything and still considering it Episcopal. Like,
Yeah.
modified Episcopal. But actually, we're more like, it's just like, what in the world?
Yeah. I hinted at this before we recorded. What shocked me the most, the stated position of the Missouri Synod is amillennialism.
Really?
And the majority of the LMCM and the ELCA, the majority of those churches are also amil.
Really? I did not find that.
That shocked me.
I don't believe that. That's crazy.
You can go. It's the stated position of the Missouri Synod.
Okay. Now, this might be this is a little bit of a hot take. A lot of the Lutherans that I have met wouldn't know that.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the majority of Baptists I've met.
Yeah, a lot of church members don't realize what their church's stated belief is.
Yeah.
Which is sad, because you should know what your church teaches. I haven't been to a lot of Lutheran services, but I've listened to a couple in order to kind of get a little bit more of a, which the Wisconsin sermons, those are so interesting to listen to. You have to give a couple of those a listen. But I did listen to one on a little bit more end times theology, and it was from, I think it was ELCA or whatever, which wasn't one of the ones you listed as
the ELCA. Most ELCA churches
would be
are amil.
Okay, and it they didn't say that word. It was maybe hinted at. So I guess I do believe. I don't doubt you. But that's very interesting.
Yeah. I found that really.
I don't know how serious they take it.
Maybe I should be Lutheran. Join my amil brothers.
I mean, it's Episcopal. There you go. Modified.
Let me just go join the ELC real quick.
Oh gosh, no. I will stop you.
The ELC, the ELCA is really. I saw one. This is like a YouTube comment. He was like, "Man, it's sad to see, but really in the ELCA, anything goes."
Yeah, it's true.
Which, I mean, so like the Trinity, the deity of Christ, the literal resurrection of Jesus, the virgin birth, right? Typical like foundational Christian doctrines.
Yep.
That both the LCMS and the LCMC both affirm. There are some ELCA churches that the pastor disagrees with those, and they're still allowed to be the ELCA.
Mm-hmm.
So like, it kind of is true that it is anything goes. In the ELCA. It's also why it's the largest denomination, because they're not going to. If I passed an ELCA church and I decided that the Trinity wasn't correct, I could still be in the ELCA.
Mm-hmm.
Which I don't know how. I haven't really talked to ELCA members if they really have a thought on that, or if they even know that.
I have quite a few family members that used to be ELCA, and then as they started becoming more progressive, they moved over to Missouri Synod Lutheran. Mm-hmm. And there's one in town here, and they had a pretty big exodus once they started changing things around.
Yeah, the ELCA, mostly, not all, but mostly would affirm gay marriage, whereas the Missouri Synod would uphold that is in fact a sin. Same with the LCMC. They also would say it is sin and should not be affirmed. I found what's interesting for abortion. The mostly ELCA churches would affirm gay marriage, but it's much more mixed when we get to abortion. It's much more kind of a 50-50-ish, which I found kind of interesting. I would think those two would be more tied together than what I saw in my research. Either way, it's sad to see that those are a part of a quote unquote evangelical church. On this podcast, we will not sugarcoat, but abortion is in fact murder. And the Bible is clear when it comes to homosexuality. No matter how you try to define that Greek word, it is clear that marriage is supposed to be between one man and one woman.
Yep.
So if you disagree with that, don't listen to the podcast, or do.
Email the podcast at.
Email us at podcast@theo-doxan.org. It's in the description.
Give us a good argument.
Also, I forgot to shout out Josiah.
Oh, yes. Hi, Joe.
Does
he go by Joe?
No.
Oh, sorry, Joe.
He emailed the podcast Parmesan.
Heck yeah.
Which, if you listened all the way through the Baptist podcast, we said to email that. Also, shout out to Katie, all the way from Minot, North Dakota.
Heck yeah.
Who happens to be my sister. She also emailed the podcast. Shout out to you guys. You guys are awesome. But yeah. I don't know. What else you got on your paper?
I don't know. Just it's more of a traditional church in general. But again, we already talked about the different sects. You kind of get whatever flavor you want. You can find a church nowadays, right? And here's a little soapbox. You can find a church that will believe anything you believe, right? You can cookie cutter this stuff, and America has just kind of done this, where we love what we love, and we want to be affirmed in our belief, which is really sad because while you can interpret Scripture different ways, and you can worship God in different ways, and you can practice communion different ways. There is a little bit of leeway there, but with a lot of that stuff, we have changed it where you can call yourself a Christian and you can believe something completely contrary to what I believe, or the next Christian down the street. So what is Christianity? And I think for the most part, almost all of the denominations have the right foundation, but then as you kind of get away from the original denominational view, you get a little bit crazier, and that's for every denomination, right? You get more right, you get more left, and it just screws it up. But I think for the most part, the main core denomination it is true. It's Bible based. You just look at things a little differently. So like they have different views on liturgy and their idea on missionaries and stuff like that. It's all biblical. But it looks different than the next denomination.
Yeah, a lot, mainstream, there's clumps because typically your whole theological view holds together, as long as you hold to all of it.
Yes.
That's where you kind of get, which I say that, and then people will say that about Reformed Baptists.
Yeah, exactly.
But typically, like if you hold to the entire doctrine of the traditional Lutheran beliefs, it holds together scripturally.
Yes.
Kind of. But
with the little disagreements that anyone would have.
But when you start to kind of like, I want this one over here, I want this belief over here. Like I want Calvinism from the Reformed Church, but I want this freedom thing from the Lutheran Church. Now you're starting to get the territory where your entire system of theology doesn't hold together.
Yes.
And it contradicts each other.
Yep.
And I think a lot of Christians have a contradictory theology because they very much are like, I want this piece and this piece because that's what feels right to me.
Yeah.
And we've lost kind of what does Scripture say?
So read your Bibles. This is your official permission to go and read your Bible every morning.
Permission.
Start with the Book of John and keep going. It's pretty awesome.
Or wait a week and start with Genesis chapter 6. Coming next week.
What? Let's go.
There's one thing. I forgot to say this when I kind of find something separates the Lutherans from the Reformed Church is Calvin's teachings.
Yes.
Has to be said. The most Lutherans would be positive, negative on predestination. Positive that God chooses who will be saved, but negative on God damns people to hell. And the election, the choosing is conditional on man's choice of God. And they also would disagree with the unlimited atonement, obviously because of that.
Super interesting.
And so they're kind of, you can lose your salvation. So they're pretty much just straight Arminian. I don't know where Lutherans would stand on total depravity. I didn't really look into that.
They would be total. I would say so, from what I know.
And also because people
don't
understand what total depravity is most of the time. So,
no, they don't.
And that's not for this podcast. But yeah, that's just that's a one bullet point I didn't say that I was like, hey, that's kind of important when discussing the difference between Lutherans and the rest of the churches, is that they are Arminian, they are conditional election, and they are actually, well, some would actually be on conditional election, which is interesting. But yeah,
I think that's a good benchmark to kind of figure out how different churches believe it. Not everyone believes in Calvinism, and that's fine. But I think it's a good benchmark, because off of those points, you can kind of just not rank. That's not what I'm going for. But just kind of place different churches in their belief system and then what you believe. If you are more Arminian, then you can be like, oh, okay, this makes sense. And I think it's a good way to figure out what church aligns with Scripture.
Yeah, well, it's also a great way to, like, if you don't know what denomination you agree with, like, finding a chart that's like, all right, well, I'm an Arminian, so I'm not going to be Reformed or Presbyterian.
Yep.
I could go to some Baptist churches. I could go to Lutheran churches. Baptists are the weird ones that are like, there's just some of each.
Yep.
We make fun of the Lutherans for being all over the board. Baptists are worse.
Yep. So true.
But no, you got any final thoughts on
it? This is a good topic. I like learning about these different things.
Yeah. It's fascinating.
It kind of is. I hope you guys find it fascinating.
I learned way more.
If you don't find it fascinating, why are you listening?
They probably aren't already. We're 37 minutes into this episode.
Yes, that's true.
But we got I mean, hey, we're in double digits for listens per episode. Like, heck yeah! Thank you.
Yes,
you. For listening. And making it this far in the podcast. That's all we got for Lutherans.
Yeah.
Shout out Martin Luther, I guess.
Heck yeah.
95. I love the meme where people, for like youth pastors, will tape Reese's on the door. What happened to the youth pastor at our church a few years ago? You were probably a part of that.
I remember that. It was kind of cringe, but it's hilarious.
Yep. If you made it this far, email the podcast at podcast@Theo-Doxan.org. It's in the description. And email us the word.
Gosh, we're not making this a thing.
No, we're making this a thing. Email us the word. What's something that's like
iPhone sucks.
No, people aren't gonna do that. Don't listen to Isaac. I was gonna like try to make it like kind of like about. Email us the word liturgy.
Ooh.
If you don't know how to spell it, now you gotta search it.
Yep, and then learn a bit about it. Include the definition.
But that's all we got for you. Thank you for listening. Today's sponsor is the share button. Make sure you hit the share button.
Or don't.
Yeah. But Isaac, a lot of times, these things happen.
Yeah, and I really hate blue cheese.